I'm not complaining. No, they're ugly.
Are you getting? Did she say?
And why are we wearing a whole tonight? It's already choking me. I'm wearing this. It doesn't even have AC, it just has A. It's just A. Why don't we have the dog poking the A like we have? Why don't we have the AC? We just have A for Amber. You just like, yeah, look at her. We have to wear that skirt. Kind of skirt. I know it's oh my gosh, look at the tennis shorts that tail. The boy ones, like the stripes. A mini shirt. We have to wear shorts though.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Okay. Brianna. Drew. Bria. Henry. Henry. Anna. Nick. Abby. Hannah.
Here.
Rosa.
Here.
Matt. Jillian. Here. Mia. Annie. Brianna Hills.
Here.
Brandon. Brandon. Sadie.
Here.
Jesse. William. Sophia.
Here.
Aubrey. Matthias.
Here.
Colin. Olivia.
Here.
Braden. Amber.
Here.
Katie. Kennedy. Benjamin.
Here.
Ava.
Here.
Kendall.
Here.
Emily.
Here.
Lauren.
Here.
Jennifer.
Here.
Isabel.
Here.
And Corbin. All right. Cool. So we'll go back to where we left off. Okay, so on Monday we were talking about some of these positive interactions between different microbes and populations. So we were talking about two examples in which both populations benefit. You had synergism and mutualism, and there were differences in terms of whether both partners can grow independently or not. So that's just a little summary. You guys should know those examples. And so these positive interactions between them obviously will help enhance their capability to survive. while they're interacting with other populations. So sometimes they don't necessarily compete. And so, they can coexist in habitats where neither can exist alone. And the benefits don't necessarily mean they're going to be equal, but if there are positive interactions between populations, then they're more likely to be able to coexist. So we went through this example. Any questions on this? Did this make sense to people? How having both of these together allows both populations to grow really well together in this minimal media. Whereas if they were to grow alone, they're not able to grow as well because they're both clearly providing something that the other needs in that environment in order to grow best when they are together. So these are two-way relationships where there's a positive effect. There are also one-way relationships that can occur between populations, where one population benefits and the other is unaffected. This is called commensalism. So basically, one of the main examples of commensalism is you'll hear about commensal bacteria in your gut or in your body. So those are bacteria that are able to live within us without causing harm. And so they get the benefit of having a place to live, survive, grow, reproduce, but they don't cause any harm to us. So these are common interactions. They're often occurring when the unaffected population is able to modify a habitat in a way that another population could possibly benefit. An example of that is in the human GI tract, there are anaerobes. Anaerobes are microbes that grow in the absence of oxygen. So anaerobic, you might hear anoxic, those are all the same. And an obligate anaerobe means that it cannot survive in the presence of oxygen. There are also facultative anaerobes, and so those basically prefer no oxygen environments, but they're facultative, which means that they can still use up that little bit of oxygen and not die off. So the reason why we have the obligate anaerobes being able to live in the colon and the GI tract is because those facultative anaerobes remove the oxygen for them. So in this way, they are providing a benefit for the obligate anaerobes to be able to survive without harming the host at all. There's other examples of commensalism where you can have a bacterial biofilm on the surface of a ship, and so that will then allow for other microbes to be able to attach to that biofilm and grow. The benefit for that second population is that it's getting a surface to attach and grow, but there's really, no effect on the first population. It's just a biofilm that's formed on the ship. And so, we'll talk a little bit about the context of opportunistic species and secondary infections as well. But this commensalism is a one-way relationship, and so one population benefits, the other is unaffected. Any questions here? So amensalism is basically when you have one population that produces a substance that inhibits the growth of another population. So the first population will gain a competitive edge because it's able to produce that substance and inhibit the growth of the competitive population. One key example is bacteria can produce a molecule called bacteriocin, and this is something that's produced that will kill other kinds of bacteria. So if, part of our immune system, we have commensal bacteria that don't cause harm. And so these bacteria are constantly producing things in a healthy environment to make sure that you're not getting colonized by pathogens or bad bacteria. And so one of those ways is by producing, something called bacteriocin, which is technically a bacteria's own form of antibiotics against other bacteria. Lactic acid is produced by lactic acid bacteria during food fermentation. So it basically allows the food to not get spoiled by other bacteria, because there's some bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria, that produce lactic acid. It helps make sure that there's food doesn't spoil as quickly by other bacteria. And so, again, there are other chemicals and substances that can be produced, including fatty acids, like short-chain fatty acids. We'll talk about those a little bit more later, but those are produced by good bacteria in our gut that help reduce inflammation and things that, they help protect against obesity, inflammation, inflammatory bowel disorders, and things like that. So having, good bacteria helps to keep away the bad, and there are ways by which this is actively occurring, and so the good bacteria essentially are producing substances to keep the bad bacteria out. There's also some discussion about whether our immune systems and our microbes have this kind of relationship as well, because there's really complex systems going on there, but we'll get to that. So what's the impact of negative interactions between populations? Well, this is a way for the entire ecosystem to protect itself against unwanted or intrusive organisms. So basically, you can eliminate, in a negative interaction, you can eliminate a population that is not adapted well to be able to exist in that habitat. The other key example, the negative interactions are also very good, to have, because they help prevent the invasion of a community that's already established. It can prevent invasion of that community. So that established community is composed of an indigenous population, which means the native microbes, those normal microbes, they're commensal, they don't cause harm. And so colonization resistance is a term that I'll definitely drill into your heads, that helps to basically prevent the invasion by a foreign population into that established indigenous population. So negative interactions are important, and they actually help maintain what we call community stability in that ecosystem. Any questions so far? So all of this really comes down to resources. And remember, resources in the environment are going to be constantly changing. So usually, you have this influx of nutrients that's happening in cycles. So you have a large pulse of nutrients that could then be followed by a period of nutrient deprivation. Microbes in nature also kind of are always facing this existence of a feast or famine dynamic, where, for example, some microbes can produce, storage polymers. Basically, when they have a lot of resources abundant, they can kind of store some of those sugars and polymers and stuff inside their cells as a reserve. And then once, there's periods of cellular starvation or nutrient deprivation, they can draw upon those reserves. So having exponential microbial growth in nature is pretty rare. You're not gonna, or at least extended periods of it. So usually these resources come and go more intermittently, and that influences how quickly, the bacteria can grow or not. So microbes, especially, in the lab, typically grow in spurts, and so that is linked to the availability of resources. And so E. coli in the lab can double in 20 minutes, in the gut it takes about 12 hours. Can anybody maybe, let's just a thought question, maybe think about why that might be, that you can grow E. coli in the lab, it takes about 20 minutes to double, and in the gut it takes about 12 hours. Yeah.
Because in the lab, we only give them food and there isn't other things competing with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So in the lab, you've isolated it and you're just culturing it on its own in the media that it needs. And so there's nothing else in the environment competing. And in the gut, obviously temperature is different. pH is different. Other microbes are there. There's an immune system at play as well. So there's so many other factors. Great. So in amensalism, there is antagonism. I don't want you guys to get this confused with competition, because competition occurs when two populations are striving for the same resource. Usually it's for a single nutrient present in limiting concentration, so there's not enough of that nutrient, and two populations are competing for it. But also, competition can be for space, electron acceptors, other factors, so not just nutrients, but that's kind of the key example that we use. So as a result, both of those populations then can achieve lower densities than they would be able to grow on their own in the absence of competition, because they're competing. So they're not exactly going to grow as well as if they were alone, but they still want to grow, so they just are happier at a lower density. Usually when you have a competitive interaction, you get one that kind of wins the race. So what this means is that it results in exclusion of a closely related population, and it's closely related because it's clearly going to utilize the same environment or resource, so it's got to be related a little bit, but these competitive interactions tend to result in exclusion of the less successful population. So here's an example where we have two organisms, P. aurelia and P. caudatum. Doesn't matter what they're called, but these are amoebas, and so when they're grown separately, they can grow pretty well on their own. So this is a growth curve. And then when you put them together and they have to compete for the same resources, then you get one of them growing much better. So we have the P. aurelia growing much better, and the caudatum is not able to grow as well. In this case, the caudatum is competitively excluded by the Peelle207 aurelia. Does that make sense? So now I want to introduce you to a term that we're going to be using a lot. It's called competitive exclusion, and this is an example of that. But this actually can be a really good thing in populations as well, because it can help prevent two populations from occupying the same ecological niche. So each microbe has genes that encode, proteins and get translated into proteins, and proteins have functions. So microbes have functions, and you don't want them, to all be playing the same functional role in the same location. So competitive exclusion can be a good thing. You don't want too much of a good thing. So when two populations compete for the same limiting resource, one will succeed, the other will fail. And as a general rule for this competitive exclusion dynamic, the population with the higher growth rate under those conditions will prevail over the population with the lower growth rate. Competitive exclusion is this general idea, where you have two populations and one of them competes against the other and excludes it from that niche. But this is also known as colonization resistance in the context of the gut microbiome. And so this idea where the gut microbiome, the bacteria in the gut, they prevent the invasion of new species that are pathogenic. So this is called colonization resistance. And there's multiple things at play here, including this competitive exclusion, as well as amensalism. And so just to kind of give you an overview of what's happening here, you have the schematic of the gut microbiome. You have the epithelial cells on the bottom, and then a mucus layer on top. Mucus helps to protect the gut, and we'll definitely learn a little bit more about the gut microbiome later on in the semester. But you have these microbes here in the lumen, the pinks, blues, and yellows. And so these are what we call commensal bacteria. So these are just bacteria that are able to colonize and not cause any harm. We have good bacteria in our gut as well. And so these bacteria are constantly, doing all of these things. They have these mechanisms to make sure that, you don't have a pathogen that's able to just come in and take over. So there are secretion of antimicrobials. So basically we talked about the bacteriocin as an example. It's secreted by one organism to antagonize another, and so that's amensalism that's going on. There are examples where you have a pathogen coming in, and so you have, these species just kind of playing, they surveil and they protect, and they are big players in immunity as well. I'm not going to get into all the details because I could, and that would be a whole different lecture. But one of the things that I want to mention is when you take broad spectrum antibiotics, broad spectrum meaning that they have a more broad coverage for a lot of different microbes, this will basically kill the majority of the good bacteria. And so when you have a pathogen, you take an antibiotic and it kills the pathogen, but there's also, the risk of killing a lot of the good bacteria that are producing these molecules and things that competitively exclude pathogens. Now that can then create a niche for something to overgrow and become a pathogen because you're killing off the good bacteria. So antibiotics are great, when we need them, but I think prescribers should be more judicious about prescribing antibiotics because there's a lot of secondary effects that can occur when you deplete the good bacteria, and that gives rise to more pathogens being able to occupy that space because these good bacteria are no longer there. Does that make sense? So really important terms. Colonization resistance, competitive exclusion are used interchangeably. Amensalism is occurring here as well, but these are direct mechanisms. So neutralism is when you have low rates of metabolic activity, which characterize the resting stages of microbes. So they kind of coexist without competing. They don't really want to interact. So usually that means you have low population densities, you don't have a lot of them, and low metabolic activity, which allows them to coexist without competing for the same available resources in the habitat. So it's more likely to happen at low population densities because then they're less likely to come in contact with each other. This is neutralism, everybody's neutral. And then if they become actively growing, then it's hard to maintain this neutralism. So that's why it's more likely to occur when the population density is low. Okay. So a one-way relationship can occur in which one population benefits and the other is harmed. This is called parasitism. So it's not necessarily predation. It's not a lion that wants to eat. A parasitic relationship is basically when you have a relatively long period of contact between two organisms. The parasite is usually smaller than the host. And usually the parasite will normally derive its nutritional requirements from the host cell that it's in. And in that process, the host is damaged. So think of literally a parasite that's going to grow in the body. It's going to use the cellular machinery to replicate, grow, survive, and reproduce. And this causes damage to the host. You get sick. There are examples of plant pathogens, animal pathogens, infectious diseases. This is parasitism, but don't get that confused with predation, which is a lion that wants to eat. You know, a lion is bigger than its food, essentially, so it's not necessarily parasitism. The two distinguishing things are that in parasitism, there's a relatively longer period of contact, and the parasite is generally smaller than the host. Okay, so the intensity of these positive and negative interactions between populations generally are greatest when there's high population densities and when the populations are actively growing, right? Because then they are able to interact with each other, there's resources in the environment, and so they're competing. And so obviously if you have fluctuations in environmental conditions, this can lead to shifts in the competitive balances. It can result in populations oscillating within the microbial community. They come back up, they go back down a little bit. So it's never completely, stable and the same. It's constantly changing according to the environment and fluctuations in environmental conditions. There's also something, while these organisms are able to live, with each other and among each other, there's also a concept called spatial separation, which is a way that different communities are separated from each other. So it allows microbes to be able to escape competitive pressures and helps permit coexistence of these populations. This is really relevant in the human microbiome because a lot of our niches where we find different microbes are separated. For instance, our mouth, our airway, and our gut are all connected, but separated as well in terms of the different organisms that can survive. Because in our gut, for instance, at the very bottom of our gut in our colon, it's an anaerobic environment, low oxygen. So the microbes that are going to grow there are going to be different than the microbes that are going to grow in our mouths because we have way more exposure to air. So spatial separation is really important as well. Okay. So in most cases, a given species has an effect on a small number of other species, but not on the entire community. So, which is good, because if you have extinction of one species, if it's killed off, then it doesn't really affect any of the long-term viability of the entire ecosystem. Other species in the community then can provide that missing physical, chemical, or metabolic element to the community. So in most cases, losing one species isn't going to be detrimental to the community. However, sometimes the loss of one species can actually have a disproportionately large effect on the entire community. And this type of species is called a keystone species. So a keystone species is a species that plays a role in its community that is far more important than its relative abundance might suggest. Its relative abundance is the population density, how much of it is there. So even if it's not there in high numbers, having it there and having it play its role and have its function is really, really important. So the more abundant species, the ones that are way more abundant in the ecosystem, usually they're, the major energy producers, and they're really important for the maintenance of the community, but they're not keystone species. Keystone species typically exist in smaller numbers. They can be predators, sources for food. They just provide some other essential factor for the community, and when you lose them, they can have a disproportionately large effect on the entire community. Any questions? All right, we'll continue next week with some more. This is what I have for you today.